today on the Protagonistas, I'll be chatting with Gail about her new book. Oh my gosh, I don't have the title on here. Where is it? Choosing Us, right? What is the
Yes.
subtitle?
It's Marriage and Mutual Flourishing in a World of Difference.
Yes, so good. And I just adored everything that you had to say. I loved, I haven't, and again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I haven't read a marriage book in a while. I feel like most white evangelicals love to write marriage books. And,
Right.
so I was just so excited to like not have, it's been years. So I was like, ooh, this is fun to wrestle and reflect on my own marriage, through y'all's words. And so I thank you. But before we begin to talk about marriage, I'd love for you to share with us about your spiritual background. I always start with that so that folks can get some context as to, where you're coming from.
Well, that's good. I come from a Pentecostal background, Korean immigrant Pentecostal and Black Pentecostal, Kojic specifically. And then just over the course of my life, my adulthood, I've worked in multi-ethnic, charismatic Pentecostal churches. And then I went to a United Methodist seminary at Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. And now I'm trying to find my way and carve out some space in this evangelical world.
Right. Oh, that's so great. So you've definitely had your share of backgrounds and different contexts, spiritual contexts, and all that kind of stuff, which, plays, I'm sure, a huge role into the church that you're in, the community that you're forming, which I'm sure is just so wonderful. And so I would love to hear more about that. But first, like I said, white evangelicals love to write marriage books. And so I would love to hear just about the inception of this book, and the writing process. I feel like you and your husband, you both seamlessly weave your voices into this book, and it feels so natural, and it doesn't feel, because sometimes when you have two different people writing, it can feel choppy, but this doesn't feel that way at all. So how did you make it work? In the book, you also mentioned that you did it in the pandemic and with a puppy, and I got a puppy right before I had a baby, and it was the craziest decision I ever made. And so I'm just wondering, how did you make all of it work?
Listen, this book, when we decided to do it, first of all, I never went into this wanting to write as my first book, a book on marriage, right? And this is where the Pentecostal comes in. So I'm glad that you asked me that. But I was at the beginning of the year. I always do this fast, and sometimes I hear things. Sometimes I don't want to do things that I feel like God is calling us to do. And 2020, legit January, I woke up one day and felt like we had to write a book together.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing.
And if you've ever talked to people who've co-written books, it could either go really good,
right,
or it could be destructive.
Right.
So I go to Brian and I'm like, listen, babe, I feel like we're supposed to write a book. What should we write about? Oh, well, maybe we could just write about marriage. I was like, are you kidding me right now? And so we were like, okay, we're going to write a book on marriage. And I don't know if you know my context, but I'm leading a church in this particular space. Our building used to be the former Mars Hills Church, who also wrote a book on marriage.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so you can imagine all the things going through my mind. And then March hits, and it's a pandemic.
Right,
Kat, we have never argued so much in our marriage as we did during this pandemic and while we were writing this book.
Wow.
And so there were a couple of times where we looked at each other, what are we doing? Why are we writing a book on marriage? And then, like all good people do, you get a puppy when your kids are just about grown and leave the house. But then they all came back home because of the pandemic.
Oh my goodness.
So we had 5 people living in this house. And then we thought it was a great idea to get a puppy that, I never grew up with dogs.
Right. Me neither. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
wild.
Yeah. Just imagine. So it was almost like it's like a lab. It's like a lab for marriages. Can you co-write a book in the midst of a global pandemic and still make it through?
Right.
And thanks be to God, here we are. And,
You did it.
in hindsight, I'm grateful. And as far as like the writing and the voicings, I think, when you're with somebody long enough, somehow like the language you use, and, he's so brilliant to like, it started rubbing off on me.
It's awesome.
And, we both went to Duke. And so every seminary I feel like has its own language,
Right.
so to speak. And so I don't know, I just feel like it was pretty smooth in the writing process. I was actually really nervous because I write more, how do I say this? More practically for the church.
Okay.
Right. So when my writing right now is really, newsletters for the church, updates for the church,
right,
preaching, that kind of writing. And to write a book, I was actually really nervous, especially alongside my husband. I was like, oh my gosh, he's a writer. He's a theologian. This is what he does. So it was kind of intimidating initially. But
once you get in the flow.
Yeah, I'm glad you think that it was smooth.
Yeah, it really was. No, it was so great. I so enjoyed reading it. And I just want to say, I absolutely love, I didn't know that your building is the old Mars Hill building. And I just love that. It's like very subversive, and like you're reclaiming that space, and you're reclaiming the marriage books that came out of there are, oh gosh, I remember actually like at one point, I think I went to like a conference, like a Mars Hill marriage it was like, oh my gosh, so bizarre. But anyway, I just want to like name that and just say, yes, that you are undoing and redoing so much harm that was done from that space and from just that, those views on marriage. And so thank you. And that's why I was saying like it felt so refreshing to read finally a marriage book that was about mutual flourishing and not the flourishing of one person or, whatever. Right. So anyway, thank you for that. Right. Okay. So you have a quote that, and this kind of goes along with traditional views of marriage that many of my listeners, I'm sure, have, heard or been a part of or whatever, been instilled in them. But you say in the beginning of the book that marriage is not the pinnacle of what it means to be made in the image of God, but one good relationship among many. And I like circled, highlighted, amen, because I just remember all the pressure and expectation that I felt before I got married, in that this is like it, right? Like, this is what we are to strive for, like everything. And, thankfully my husband and I, after we got married, we left the evangelical world. And so we did a lot of deconstructing in our views of marriage. And, as we were deconstructing a lot of our views of marriage, I realized like my marriage isn't the most important, thing in the world. It is one really amazing, important thing out of so many other amazing, important things. And I wrote a little thing about that like marriage is just, sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not. And it's just there. And it doesn't have to be, what many in the church make it out to be. It's like the church is obsessed with it. And so I love that you kind of just threw that out there. Like, it's just one great thing among many, and it's not the pinnacle, but it's just, a way that we can be, the image of God is in us. So I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that. And where, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I don't think we can actually talk about this without naming, the problematic ways, like you said, marriage has historically been articulated or even promoted in our society, and especially in the life of the church, as a kind of destiny.
Right.
And when I say destiny, I'm talking like a kind of fulfillment, prize, arrival, or even our purpose in life, right? Especially for women. Right. So even like the ability for women to reproduce is often at the center of this sentiment. And also this notion in some ways that women can't be trusted to be alone, that somehow women need men to thrive. Right. And so if you look at the American 50s society, this notion of nuclear family becomes the basic kind of building block from where everything grows from, right? You've got the husband, wife, 2.5 kids, white picket fence. And in many ways, having children was what it meant to like do your part in society. So within this structure, oftentimes, especially, Brian and I were always surrounded by single folks throughout our lives, even though we were married at 21. But when you look at this kind of pinnacle kind of structure, singleness is always then deemed as not enough or something's wrong with you. So when I think about if we use this language of marriage as the pinnacle of all relationships, I just imagine a kind of pyramid. Like if I'm, for those of you who are listening, I'm actually doing my hands like a triangle, like a pyramid of relationships. So if we're saying marriage is at the top, the pinnacle of the pyramid, but then somehow the pyramid gets flipped because, life happens. That's too much weight, right? Then the pinnacle is at the bottom. The point is at the bottom, and that's too much weight for a marriage to bear alone, right? So our identities, when we say this, we're talking about our identities as never one singular relationship. We're never identified by one type of relationship, right? Because we have families, biological and chosen, friendships, single folk, even wider senses of relationships like community or churches or organization. So we always believe, Brian and I always say that when there's a multiplicity of relationships, it makes marriage a more freeing space.
Yeah, that's
and
so good.
Even for married folks, you better have a robust friendship life, a communal life, right? So whatever that looks like for folks, so critical.
Yeah, that's so good. And thank you for naming that right early on, because I think that, like you said, it's too much weight and it's too much pressure and it's too much expectation on, that nobody can sustain, nobody can, and I always say, talking about marriage and deconstructing views of marriage, I think so much about, when you have a non-egalitarian view of marriage, again, like that's not just harmful for women, but that's harmful for men. Men can't.
Absolutely.
That's too much weight. That's too much pressure. That's too much for a man to lead and all of these things. And so yeah, there needs to be equilibrium in that sense. And talking about this, so I was going to ask you this later, but I feel like this kind of fits with this. You have a chapter on, women and gender roles and these kinds of things. And you talk about glass bulbs versus rubber balls. And within that, so I want you to talk a little bit about that, but within that, I absolutely love your critique of the phrase juggling or like balancing. And you kind of talk about how you don't like that how people are like, yeah, I'm just juggling or I'm balancing. And I love that because I use that all the time. Like I'm just juggling. And so when I read that, I was like, yes, thank you. You're giving me, like language is so important and you're giving me other words to use. And you say, creation is never a juggling act. Life is about cycles. So can you talk to us about the glass bulbs, the rubber balls, and then also this idea of not using juggling, but using cycles?
Yeah. Being in ministry. Okay. So having been married young, having kids at 23, being in ministry from the time I was 21, and being around lots and lots of women in all different stages of life, and even including myself being very career driven. There's a lot that, however, 15, 20 years ago, I would have said I was juggling. And anytime I used that sentiment, I was like, this can't be faithful. Because then it's this stress and anxiousness of not letting anything fall or drop. And God forbid something drops. Right. But I realized over the course of many different seasons of life, that there are things that you can let drop, your rubber balls, that are not as fragile in that particular season of your life that will bounce back. But then there are certain things in that particular moment of your life that are like glass bulbs that you have to care for, that you have to attend to, you have to be very intentional about. And in that chapter, I talk a lot about sometimes it's the new things in life, or the transitions, or the shifting things that we're experiencing in life, whether it's new relationships, new jobs, new city, new friendships, or even a loss of something, right? That's a new space that we're occupying.
Right.
Those often tend to be our glass bulbs that we want to be very attentive to, both individually and as a couple, right? To know that, hey, if this drops, it can be catastrophic.
Yeah.
But because we're attending to this in this particular moment, what in our life can we hold a little loosely? Knowing that if it drops, we're not going to be devastated. It'll bounce back. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And I thought that was so, sorry, go ahead.
And in that, like when we're using analogies of, creation and created order and nature, nothing is juggling. Creation does not juggle itself, but there's that of cycles or seasons. I like to use either one of those interchangeably.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same with our lives, right?
Right. That's so good. I'm going to turn the light on because the sun went down and I'm like,
oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Give me one second. Okay. That's better. See, it's like, that's right. Okay. Anyway, but yes, that is so helpful. Like I mentioned, that sort of language helps just reframe just how we even think of it. And it's true. I mean, there is seasons and cycles and, I just had a baby. And so I'm like learning how to, do this new huge thing, and right now it does feel like I'm juggling, but like you said, it's not that I'm juggling. It's that this is new and this is a season. And this is just, I'm going to eventually move into a new space and, it'll look different or feel different.
Right.
So thank you. So you also use this phrase when it comes to flourishing. And since we've been talking about, how relationships and how these things work, you talk about flourishing as a give and take and as a pushing and a pulling. And I also really loved that. I thought that was also a good way, to think of it, even thinking of this idea of cycles or even seasons, of giving, taking, pulling, pushing, a reciprocal thing. And I really like that because you frame that as like flourishing is not just individual, right?
That's right.
And when we're doing justice work and we know that it's collective, we know that, as I heal, we're healing together and we're being liberated together. But I love the idea of flourishing as a pushing and a pulling. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that, particularly when it comes to marriage?
Yeah, I often like to think about it like a dance, right? When you think about relationships like a merengue or salsa, you can do it alone.
Right.
And really good dancers can make it look really good doing it alone, but it's more beautiful and powerful when others are involved and when both parties are fly and in step, right? And it's very much like kind of this Trinitarian notion of God, right? This perichoretic existence, 3 in 1. They are not one without the other.
Right.
And when I think about the Godhead and who God is, it is like a dance. It is like this kind of giving and taking, receiving and offering, pushing and pulling. And so when we think about marriage and really any kind of relationship as fluid, as organic, there are, again, seasons and cycles when one person is probably more in need of attention, of receiving than the other. And then over time, it's the other person, right? And just being really attentive to one another. And this is where in a lot of relationships, we're mindful that we sometimes have to come out of ourselves. And, chapter 2 is all about learning the other person, reading the other person. What does that other person need in order to flourish, and where do I need to pull back, and vice versa. So that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about flourishing as a kind of pushing and pulling. It's like a dance.
Yeah. That reminds me, I think a lot. So I wrote this in my book, Abuelita Faith, of how when we like when we think about the quote unquote, like the other, right? In Christian spaces, particularly in traditional Christian spaces, we think as us only as the ones serving or the ones giving, right? And not as the ones receiving. We think, when it comes to marginalized people, right? Let's invite them to our table instead of, and I call this like a sort of decolonized notion of discipleship or hospitality, where no, let's go to their table, and because people have their own tables, right? So let's sit at someone else's table and let's receive, right? And I think that, and actually you said something about this. You said the beauty in learning the other is that it transforms us. Our transformation is not just for our sake, it also enables the greater good of the whole. And I love how you frame that as that when I learn about the other, whether it's my spouse or whether it's, the quote unquote other in my midst, it's not just for their sake, right? It's not just where I, it's not a me giving, but it's also a receiving. Like I'm being transformed and I'm being renewed in that relationship. I'm learning, right? There's mutuality and there's reciprocity. And I see that so much in the life of Jesus. Like Jesus sat with folks and learned from folks and received from folks and, was changed by folks, I think. So yeah, if you want to speak a little bit to that as well, the idea of that learning about the other transforms us for the whole.
Absolutely. And I think when we're attentive to the other, when there's a sense of reciprocity, the transformation in us, right, is never that we might be well, just in and of itself, in and of ourselves, right? But that transformation hopefully will open our eyes and our hearts and our bodies and our minds to be more empathetic, to know what it means to advocate. Right. And so I talked a little bit about, Brian with his hearing loss. Right. And just being ignorant at the beginning of our relationship and like not understanding, not being empathetic. But once I began to really like take on his world and be transformed by it, and his anxiousness in public as a result of it, you grow a sense of, I'm transformed. I'm like, I need to do what I can to make sure he's able to thrive in public spaces. That's advocacy. That's empathy. And so in the midst of my own transformation, empathy is not just something I hoard for myself. Right. But it's offered.
Right. Yeah. That's so good. So I want to talk a little bit about you mentioned your relationship with your mother and your relationship with your father and obviously how that formed you. And I was so interested in hearing about how your mom, when you were 11 years old, she just like packed her things and went to seminary. And I thought that was incredible, just given your cultural context and some of the stuff that you mentioned, like what's expected of Korean women or things like that. And so can you talk to us a little bit about that? And also how did that shape, your ministry and your calling? And you talked about how you had a completely different plan and you ended up pastoring just like your mother, or just as your mother wanted to do. And so you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's a reality in the moment, and then there's a hindsight perspective, right? In the moment, it was actually very hard, as a girl, 11 years old. And my parents' relationship was struggling. They were both in ministry. My mom, much more kind of pursuant of it.
Right.
But, in Korean culture, you're met by barriers and boundaries. And I just witnessed her fighting her way through a lot in the Korean church with Korean men, trying to carve out a space for herself. And I think after a little while, she knew she was called. And I think, I swear, I think she's an 8 on the Enneagram, or she was an 8 on the Enneagram. She was just going to carve her own way, So she's like, I'm going to go to seminary. And she was 40 years old, English as a second language.
Right.
And I think it was part call, part convenience, like I'm leaving dad. Right. And she just picked up her things, went to Tulsa, Oklahoma to go to seminary. And for 6 months, it was just me and my brother and my dad. in Chicago. And, you know, in that season of my life, I was like, nah, I can't do this. And so I asked my mom, I was like, can I come live with you? And so I moved down to Tulsa when I turned 12 and lived with her, and just watched her struggle, helped her with her reading. And, you know, here I am 12, 13, 14 years old, reading theological textbooks and like trying my best to help her with papers and English and editing and, you know, things that, right? I mean, things that no kid should actually have to do, but it did something in me. Her sense of call and assuredness in her call. Only to find that after she graduated, she tried to find a place that would ordain her, that would even rent a place out for her in the afternoon, and nobody would do it until this Lutheran church. And when I was a sophomore, or right before I was a sophomore in college, I went home for summer break, diagnosed with cancer, died 2 months later. And, you know, I always say that there's something really profound about death that shifts our perspective on what matters, I think, even when you're young. And so while I had all these plans, right, I wanted to be a conductor. I was in the music world. I really sensed that God was calling me to ministry. And people had told me when I was young, but I just ignored it. Like, no, why would I want that life? I'm like looking at my mom. I'm like, why would I want that life? Who would sign up for that? I'm going to be a musician, or I'm going to be a conductor. I'm good, you know? And then my mom dies and my world is rocked. I actually saw a friend's status the other day who just lost her mom, and she described it so beautifully. It's as if her world became smaller. And it's so true. Like, the person who brought you into this world, for many folks, right? Not all, but the only person you know that has been there from the moment you took your first breath is gone. And so it just shifts your whole perspective on what matters. Tomorrow's never promised. So I better obey God. Right. And so from that moment on, I was like, okay, God, I'll do it. And since I graduated undergrad, went right into ministry, didn't know what I was doing. Like crazy stories. That may be my next book. I just want to write crazy stories about my life as a 21-year-old through 30-year-old, people thinking I was still a teenager, you know, trying to make it in this world. But yeah, I mean, I think it in hindsight now, I think her life and her body, her presence, her fight gave me a greater imagination for what is possible for me. Where I know that that's not the story for a lot of women, and especially Korean American women, right? We've never seen it, so we don't even have an imagination for it. Right. But that's not my story. So I owe a lot to my mom for, you know, living in such a way, living in conviction that just is bearing fruit in my life.
Wow. That's incredible. That really is an incredible story. And so was it right after her death that you changed courses? I mean, were you like on the way to doing music, you know, stuff? And wow.
Yeah. And then I met Brian. So Brian's actually critical in this story, because I kind of walked away from God after that because I was so mad. And my faith was rocked for a little while. But I met Brian because his dad had died just right before, and a mutual friend just connected us. And his faith was so solid, and he was kind of newer to faith. So, you know, that kind of zeal. That both shamed me and made me feel guilty. So I was like, I better get my life right with God. But yeah, I mean, and meeting somebody for whom just really valued my gifts and my call. And yeah, so I even almost dropped out of school because I was like, oh, I'm called to ministry. Why am I at this music conservatory? in New York. But we decided, let's just go ahead and finish, get the degree, and then pursue ministry. So here I am.
Yeah.
24 years later.
Wow. And leading an entire church.
It's wild. Which I never wanted to do, right? I never wanted to be a lead pastor.
Wow.
I know.
But how God works. So talking about your music, I was interested in this. You talked about how growing up, you didn't ever know a life apart from learning, honing, crafting, and perfecting something with the intensity they say being a professional musician or athlete cultivates. And I was just curious about how that came out in your marriage, in your personal life, in your ministry, and how did you navigate that as you got older? How has it been helpful for you? And in what ways did you have to, work through it?
When I saw this question, I was like, oh man, that's a really good question. Nobody's asked me that before.
Oh, yay.
And I've never actually thought about it. And I'm just going to be just raw here because I've never actually thought about it. I'm wondering if I've actually just kind of separated my relational life from like work life.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure if you ask my husband, he would probably be able to give you a list of the ways that I tried to perfect this marriage. But I don't know, like, I feel like we didn't actually have good models of healthy relationships growing up. So early on, I didn't actually know what I was working toward. Right. And I think maybe, so this is where I'm thinking, maybe my drive in that sense is less about perfecting or honing my marriage or even as a parent, but it was more a sense of control. Especially since my life, losing parents, my dad disowning me when I was 20, right? It's destabilizing. So I think in my marriage that was new, didn't have any models, and parenting, not having my parents around, maybe it was more of a sense of control. I do know that like there are times when I just wanted to keep it together.
Right.
With this sense of trying to figure out who I was and wanted to be in the world. I do know that, having our kids young, my first at 23.
Wow.
I will say there are times when like I tried to perfect my kids. I was like, these kids are going to be perfect, right? These, my house is going to be perfect. And then you have your first kid and there's just stuff everywhere. And you're like, okay, whatever. That's not going to work. Let me perfect my kid. And then you realize you hit middle school and you're like, okay, whatever. That's not going to work. And then middle school kind of lasts between 3 kids, like 9 years, like almost a decade.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I learned that relationships have to be fostered. I do still, I'm sure my husband would say I do still try to control him. But I've learned ways to do it where, he doesn't feel bad about it. You do it in question form, were you going to take out the garbage? Because that gives him an out. We always talk about that. It gives him an out, as opposed to, you were supposed to take out the garbage. Just like, were you going to take out the garbage? And then that gives him like, yes, I was. I was going to do it in an hour.
I do the same thing to my husband when he leaves his clothes on the bathroom sink. Did you leave that on purpose, or were you going to go back and are you putting that on?
Right. It always works better in question. But now my husband's onto that. He's like, can you not? Yeah.
So funny.
I know. I think in kind of all seriousness, I think the honing and perfecting my musical background actually comes out more in my work. If you ask my colleagues and our staff here, they'll probably be like, oh yeah, that's where it's at.
Right.
Because it's more about producing something, cultivating something, that you'll kind of see that tendency more in me. And hopefully, I hope I'm getting better at it and more healthy at it. Especially in the church context, right? Because the work you do is with other people.
Right. Yeah. Along those lines,
Yeah.
there was a quote that you said that stood out. You said, marriage is not a sourdough recipe that can be
Mm,
perfected with just enough time. And I love that, because you'd think, right? I guess the way that people talk about marriage is that with time, yeah, you perfect it, right? So what would you, if it's not that way, how else would you describe it?
Okay, so this is what I'm learning. So
Mhm.
I'm not a baker, but during the pandemic, I've learned a lot about bread
Yeah.
making. Because like I feel like everybody at this church and in
Yes.
Seattle was trying to make sourdough bread. My
Everybody
son,
everywhere.
oh, is it really? My
Oh
youngest
yeah.
son was also trying to make sourdough bread. So I would find these like jars of nasty smelling things in random cabinets. And I realized sourdough. Okay, I was like, what's the difference between that and other bread? Because he was making other bread too. And
Mhm.
when we say sourdough recipe can't be perfected with just time, because sourdough is not, that's not how it works.
Mm.
Right? Sourdough requires this thing called a starter,
Mm. Mhm.
right? Um, there's a lot of variables with starters. Like I learned that you got to nurture. It's like a living organism. People were passing around starters, like they would make it and then
Right.
somehow they would say that they divided it and gave it to somebody. I was like, what are y'all talking about? But what I learned was sourdough starter has to be nurtured. Like
Mm.
you really have, there's a lot of variables like humidity or the amount of
Right.
light, etc. Right? So it's not just a matter of making dough, waiting for it to rise and then baking it. Like, right. So this kind of timed reality, but um sourdough, I feel like is time plus other things,
That's good.
right? So there's
Yeah.
no such thing as a sourdough recipe or a marriage that can be perfected with just time alone. You got to work at it, you got to
Hmm.
nurture it.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of work that goes into it before you actually um, like see the result, the fruit of it, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make
That's so
sense?
good. Yeah, that makes sense. I actually used to make kombucha. And so it's the same, I guess it's the same
Oh,
idea that you have this living thing, right? And
right,
you can divide it up, but you, like you said, you have to nurture it. You have to, because it'll die and then
right.
you're done, you know?
Yeah.
So that's good. That's good. I love that analogy. Okay. I want to talk about gender roles. I know we touched a little
Mhm.
bit on them before, but you asked this question and you wrestle with it. And I thought it was really good, because I have felt like, so my husband and I was actually talking with a mom group recently, and I said, one of the most surprising things about for me in a season of becoming a mom was
Mhm.
my spouse and I, we are 100% 50-50 on everything we do, right? We're
Mhm.
super egalitarian, like
Mhm.
everything is perfectly 50-50. And I was not expecting to become a mom and it not be that way. And as much as he does, I mean, of course, even in how we take care of our child and everything, but, even in just the comfort of my child and the feed, I'm breastfeeding. And even that alone is 75% of the time and energy. And it
Right.
took me a while to be okay with the fact that I'm the primary, and of course, I'm sure that changes as my child gets older and, things like that. But it was a struggle for me. And so when you ask this
Right.
question, do gender roles always win? I was
Mhm.
like, whoa, that is such an interesting question. And I'm sure the answer is not a clear yes, obviously, or not a clear no. There's a wrestling with it. But yeah, it just struck me because
Mhm.
in this season, I have felt like, man, I wanted it to be, I didn't want to be the primary caregiver because we're going to be 100% 50-50, but
Right.
I am. And and I just have to, and that's fine. Right. So I'm working
Right.
through that. Right. But can you talk
Right.
to me about sort of just this question you're wrestling with it? Do gender roles always win?
Yeah. And I will say it's like it's like gravity. The pull is so strong. And being married to somebody who I feel like is so self-aware.
Mhm.
very, very aware of his own body,
Mhm.
the maleness of his body, and the ease in which this world has been literally created for him,
Mhm. Mhm.
and bodies like his, Um, even with that, I will say that to this day, we still have to have conversations because the pull
Yeah.
is just so strong that
Right.
we have to be intentional.
Mhm.
We have to always call it out. And
Right.
as women, like, we can't be afraid to call it out.
Mhm.
And to call it out doesn't mean that you're not equal, that
Right.
you're not, that your spouse or your partner is failing,
Mhm.
right? It's just this, like we always say, that it's like the air we breathe.
Mhm.
It just is.
Right.
And so I think for me, I've always had to be very mindful. So um, with all of our kids, with the first one, I really wanted to breastfeed.
Mhm.
And you read this, that I didn't even imagine having kids. So
Mhm.
here I
Mhm.
am. I didn't even imagine being married until I was in my 30s, right? I was very
Right.
career driven, very independent. So here I am, 23, with my first child. Like, can you just imagine, right there alone?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm the one that had like the certainty of call and what I wanted to
Right.
do in life. And Brian was just like, oh, maybe I want to do this, maybe I want to do
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
right? And here my body is the one that can create this baby.
Right.
Or as we say nowadays, make people,
Mhm.
right? I made my person, I made a person. And so there's realities to that. And I wanted to breastfeed. But this child came out so large, and there was
Wow.
all kinds of medical
Mhm.
issues that we were dealing with, that I wasn't able to, that Brian had to take care of our firstborn
Mhm.
immediately. So we opted for the bottle
Right.
formula.
Mhm.
I was literally bedridden
Wow.
for 2 weeks.
Mhm.
And I think that reality actually helped us. Now, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that one way is better than the other, but I think what that did to me
Yeah.
was, oh, if you can afford it, which we were scraping coupons for formula, but if you can afford it, something about anybody being able to feed your child
Right.
at any given time, that your child is not going to die because they had formula,
Right.
right? That there's just these realities that I was like, oh, this is going to work. Oh, you can get
Mhm.
up at
Mhm.
night. You can feed this child,
Yeah.
right? And so it did something in me that kind of shifted. So then when we had our second child, our third child, I was like, oh, we're going to do formula.
Yeah.
We're going to do, because at that time I was working, like,
Yeah.
we had other kids, and it was,
Right.
I would say for me, for our family, it worked.
Mhm.
But I will say I was very conscientious of what we were doing
Mhm.
and why we were doing it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I realized that's not everybody's,
Right.
story or ability to do so.
Yeah.
Um, but I think in that sense, I share that because I feel like at every turn, even with the kind of husband I have and partner I have, I'm very aware when
Yeah.
we're making decisions. If I feel like majority of our decisions tend to lean toward his preferences,
Mhm.
I'll stop us and I'll call it out. I'll say,
Mhm.
hey, do you realize we've been actually doing what you've been wanting to do, or your preferences the last 4 out of the 5 times?
Mhm.
And he was like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
right. So we just have to constantly be mindful.
Right.
And I think that's where, like, do gender roles win? It doesn't have to,
Mm. Yeah.
but if we're not careful, it
It
can.
will. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. I think it certainly takes a constant being intentional. Because if
Mhm.
not, yeah, like what, it's one of those things that whatever's natural in culture and society and whatever, folks are pushing you toward will be what you just fall into and do. If you're not, really fighting against it. And that goes in so many aspects and so many things. But yeah, I
Right.
thought that was good that you wrestled with that question. Because it's easy for it is easy for gender roles to win if we don't actively make sure they don't.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so one last question. You talk about how, or I'll just read another quote because I love doing
Okay.
that, just having you expand on them. But you say peace. So you're talking about peace and sort of your wrestling with peace, as you were growing up Pentecostal and just, in ministry. And you talk about how peace is the complicated marriage between what is just and what is possible or what could be. I thought that was such a cool line. If you can elaborate a little bit more on that and your understanding of peace.
Yeah. When I was younger, it wasn't always celebrated, right? This almost a violence in peace, or this notion of, in order to get to peace, sometimes it requires tension and rubbing. And I shared some stories in there, but I think for me, peace is always achieved when there's a sense of shalom. When there's injustice, when there's wrong in your community, in your sphere, in your world, in your life, you'll never experience peace unless there's a kind of working out of a kind of the way it ought to be, or a sense of shalom. And that's simply what I mean. Sometimes, and I use very practical examples of, sometimes you can't be at peace with something or someone unless, I talk about an incident where I felt like people were being wronged in my circle. And, even though I knew I was going to get in trouble for the way I handled it, I felt a deep sense of peace that this particular moment, this particular person had to know where I stood, where we stood about what was just and what was right, what was loving. And I didn't feel bad about it. Right. And I think as we get older, though, we mature in what that looks like. It's not always physical fights on the playground,
Right.
as I name. But I think that's, for me, I'm always disrupted. There's always a disruption until there's activity, until there's work, and until I literally have to sometimes put my body on the line. So even now, as an example for our church, having become now fully affirming of our LGBTQ plus siblings, sometimes I have to put my body on the line. I have to put my credentials on the line. I have to put my reputation, my friendships on the line. And even though over the last 2 years, I've lost many friendships, I've lost many colleagues, and it's been really painful, but I feel at peace. There's a deep and profound peace in my spirit, in my soul, because I believe that we are moving in the direction of making room and abundance and enoughness in God's economy.
Yeah.
Right. There's enough for everyone.
That's so good. Amen. Thank you so much, Gail, for chatting with me and for writing this book. It is just so wonderful and I think so refreshing and so healing for, I'm sure, so many people and just even for me. And so, yeah, if you want to let folks know where they can buy it or where they can follow you or any of that information.
Absolutely. You can follow us on the Bantum Space book.com. And you can pre-order the book now. The book launches March 1, but you can pre-order anywhere books are sold. And it's called Choosing Us, Marriage and Mutual Flourishing in a World of Difference. And we're super excited about it.
Yay. I'm so excited about it too. Thank you so much.